Wonderful panel here today to discuss rights to the city. So we know that more and more cities are housing more and more of the world's population. In 1800, 3% of the world's population lived in cities. The UN predicts that by 2030, 60% of the world's population will be in cities. We know that urban policies affect where people live, where industries are located, who pays what taxes, what services are available to whom, and what kind of infrastructure is placed where. Generally speaking, urban policies determine who pays, who benefits. Decisions that affect urban communities are made at federal, state, and local levels and shape a given set of policies which have both intended and unintended consequences. But how policies are made varies with authority and typically involves efforts by stakeholders to shape or influence that policy. The form and function of any given city and the experiences of its residents reflect the range of policies that have been made over time. So we know that a lot of policies have affected us, whether it's federal transportation policies, mortgage lending, redlining, real estate covenants, urban removal programs that affect housing, that affect economic development and jobs. All of the various policies affect the experiences in cities. But we also know that we as residents, as people who live in the have for as long as we have been part of cities, we have also had a role in shaping what those cities look like and what our experiences are. So the grassroots efforts that occur in cities is critical to what those cities look like. We know also that in recent years, with the decline in corporate taxes and in corporate tax rate, that austerity policies have replaced commitments by the public sector to every aspect of social service delivery, from education to social welfare policies to infrastructure development and so on. We know that gentrification, reinvestment, and disinvestment are all things that have affected our neighborhoods, and along with that, the various social issues that go along with it. But it is the role of the grassroots that keeps us in there and that really makes a difference. So we are all here together, gathered as activists in cities to speak about some of the various issues that we face, and more importantly, what the strategies are that we are all engaged in trying to have a say-so on what our cities of the future look like, and in doing that, to assert our rights to the city. So we have an impressive set of folks here today. In your program is everyone's presentation. I will briefly tell you who they are, and they are going to all speak for 5 minutes or so in the order they're listed in the program. Tawana Petty is here from the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center in Detroit, Michigan, and you'll be very interested in hearing the wonderful things that they are doing to rebuild the power of local neighborhood economies. We also have Zenzele Isoke, who is an activist and author of Urban Black Women and the Politics of Resistance. She's also an associate professor at the University of Minnesota in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. Rosemary will say her name better than I will. Why don't you say it real quick, Rosemary?
Indubuizu.
Indubuizu. She is here from DC. DC in the house, one DC. Shauna Griffin has traveled here from New Orleans. She is an activist there with the Women's Health and Justice Initiative. Kali Akuno is here from Jackson, Mississippi, with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. And finally, Rhonda Williams, Social Justice Institute at Case Western Reserve University. This is an institute that goes hand in hand with our SJI here. She's worked in collaboration with Barbara Ransby in building up their social justice initiatives. So we've got it going on in various sites. Adam Green, who's an historian at University of Chicago, is scheduled to be here, sends his regrets that he's unable to be here. Underlying some of the questions that people will address, the questions are: what is freedom? How does our work fit into our notions of freedom? And how do we engage in building a movement that actually connects the various issues as it relates to freedom? So what are some of the pressing issues facing us? What are some good examples and possibilities for how we can address these issues? What are some of the obstacles? How are we overcoming these obstacles? And what does the city look like that represents freedom? I turn first to Tawana.
Peace, how's everybody doing? All right. So first I want to give you a little bit of a summary about what the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center is. It is a center to nurture community leadership. Grace Lee Boggs and her late husband, Jimmy Boggs, have been revolutionary activists. Well, James is deceased now, but they were revolutionary activists for Grace well over 60 years. She'll be 99 in June, and she wants to have a block party, by the way, and you're all invited. So what we do is we nurture community leadership by networking, building, guiding, focusing on political education and different methods of political struggle at the Grace Lee Boggs Center, which Grace happens to live at. And have been, and almost every revolutionary struggle that's happened in the United States has had some kind of tie into that facility since at least the 1960s. So what's happening in Detroit right now, I could give you the gloomy narrative that you probably all know about, and some of what you don't know about, like the fact that they're considering making Detroit like the drone haven of the United States. They're already testing drones, approving businesses to use drones for things as little as delivering flowers. But they're also promoting the use of drones to find criminals and track down missing bodies and things like that. We also have our police chief, who's on the cover of the NRA magazine this month. How awesome is that? We also have 120,000 families whose water are being shut off at a rate of $1,500 to $3,000 per week until they reach their number for as little as $150 past due. We have our water being privatized at this particular moment, and we also, here's the most gifted part of what's happening in our city, other than the educational shutdowns and things that you've already been hearing about, but our police department has been regulated to writing tickets and bussing down doors for warrants so that they could collect money for the city, and we've been replaced with Detroit One, which is a collaboration between ATF, FBI, DEA, Homeland Security, Michigan High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, U.S. Marshal Service, Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, Wayne County Sheriff's Office, Governor's Office, Michigan State Police, and the Michigan Department of Corrections. So Detroit One is our new community initiative to reduce crime. So I could focus on those things, and there's plenty more that I could focus on, but what I would really like to do is talk about what we're doing to combat those counter-revolutionary forces, right? Because we all know what's going on in our communities. We all know the limitations of electoral politics, and we all know that the military outweighs us when it comes to weaponry and other things. So, I mean, this is the anniversary, one of the anniversaries of MOVE, which you all know about, where if they wanted to drop a bomb on a neighborhood, they pretty well could. So I don't want to dance around the fact that we could get into an armed struggle with the United States government right now. What I want to talk about is how we can empower ourselves and our communities to do and act off of the resources that we already have inside of us, right? So when I think about things like Detroit Future City, which is kind of a urban removal type frame that they've put over our city to better the conditions in Detroit, I think about Detroit Future Youth Network, which Dakari is sitting in the office, which is a youth organization that has 12 youth organizations combined, and they work on media and educational alternatives, restorative justice, and dissecting images that you see that tell you what to eat, what to think, how to breathe, how to live, and things like that. So they're creating alternatives. I think about Freedom Growers, which is in a community that is very depressed, but those neighbors are collaborating. They're growing their own food, and you have children who are doing the work in the community. I think about 5E Gallery and the foundation, which I'm a part of, which we dissect the misogyny and sexism that's in music, and we create alternatives. And so what I want to talk about today is what we're doing to combat the 120,000 water shutoffs, the water catchment systems that we're going through the community building, how we combat the evictions we're going through the community and putting people back in those homes. Those are the things that we're doing to work against these counter-revolutionary forces that we're all facing. So, I don't want to spend a lot, and I think my panelists probably agree, is, we don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the things that are looming over our head in our communities. We want to talk about what we can do to counter that, because we have what we need, and and all we have to do is exercise that.
Greetings, everyone. First, it's just a pleasure, honor to be here on this panel. UIC has hosted some really kind of incredible gatherings over the past 15 or 20 years, including the Black Radical Congress, my very first trip to Chicago, the Race, Sex, and Hip Hop Conference, but then also more recently the Critical Ethnic Studies Conference. So it's always kind of a huge pleasure and honor to be here. Just to say a little bit about my work, I study Black women's political activism in cities, and my work is geared toward us rethinking and reconsidering what we mean when we say politics and what we mean and when we say resistance. Resistance isn't always necessarily about oppositionality, but in my work I think about it in terms of how is it that particularly Black women create spaces within cities that enable young people especially to build the will to resist the forces of neoliberalization. My work covers Newark and also more recently the Twin Cities and UAE, specifically Dubai and other places. Chronic unemployment and underemployment, exceptionally high rates of child poverty, health disparities, and mass incarceration function as the most robust forms of Black racialization in the U.S. in neoliberal times. Structural inequalities produced by intergenerational poverty have a profound impact on the distribution of life chances and life opportunities for people of African descent. Entrenched disparities in the areas of education, criminal injustice, jobs and economic opportunity, and healthcare in U.S. cities have been described as human rights violations by domestic and global non-governmental organizations and observers alike. In Newark, the Black unemployment rate is estimated to be around 9 to 24%, and that is not including the central ward of Newark, where it was much considerably higher, especially back in the 2000s. 44% of children in Newark today live in poverty, and 25% in extreme poverty. 59% of households in Newark spend more than 30% of their incomes on rent, and rent prices have increased almost 20% since 2005. And although Black people make only 13% of the population in the state of New Jersey, they make up more than 60% of the prison population. Another interesting thing that I found out recently is about 1,400 Newarkers are released from jail and back into the community every single month. And I'll share some more information about Twin Cities, Minnesota. A lot of people don't know that Minnesota has the highest numbers of racial disparities in criminal justice and education in the country, overshadowing Mississippi and Alabama. About 27.4% of Blacks in Twin Cities, and this is Minneapolis and St. Paul for those of you who aren't familiar with it, are unemployed, even though Minnesota has a statewide unemployment rate of only 5.7%, which is one of the lowest in the nation. 47% of Black children in Minnesota live at or below the poverty level. Another interesting thing, although Black people make up only 5% of this population, we make up 37% of the prison population in Minnesota. The mortality rate for Blacks in Minnesota is 810 per 100,000 compared to only 210 per 100,000 for whites. So we were asked to really reflect on the meaning of freedom, and freedom, of course, I think would require a more equal distribution of the capacity to live and be well in cities if you're not incredibly successful, wealthy, or simply, in this case, I think just lucky. But in the meantime, Black women in cities have created enclaves or garrets within cities to imagine and be well, even if it's only for a little bit of time. Black women's activisms in cities provide intellectual, spiritual, and cultural spaces in which Black women can more firmly and confidently assess and assert their humanity in the face of trying to survive extreme social, cultural, and economic violence. Working as executive directors of community institutions, we create spaces of refuge, rest, and healing, enacting what I call a geography of resistance that goes beyond toil, beyond critique, and also beyond oppositionality. Rather, resistance in this sense is a commitment to live and be well in the context of the everyday through cultivating a continuous awareness of the importance and value of Black life. And I believe that's an essential mode of resistance for all people of color in cities. Spaces like Northside Women's Space in North Minneapolis, founded by Alika Galloway and members of Kwanzaa Church, provide an open space for women and trans women and girls who have been involved in the survivor sex trade. Have found, like these women, they've found creative and risky ways that Black women can resist and rest and reflect in a city that would rather see them used up and thrown away. Alongside Northside Women's Space, Kwanzaa also offers a Freedom Summer, a free African-based summer camp that emphasizes creative writing, dancing, and cultural activities free of charge for children who live in the North Side. Similarly, in Newark, places like the LGBTQIA Center, founded by Reverend Janice Jackson, was forged by almost 15 years of fundraising, community organizing with the Newark Pride Alliance, and relationship building. So this is what I think that these spaces, and I do spend a lot of time chronicling these spaces, and this is what they look and feel like. So this is what freedom looks like and feels like in the city, in these spaces. First, being able to tell our stories and have others listen to them without judgment. And this requires learning how to be attentive to each other, learning how to listen, as well as how to hold each other's stories with integrity and care. In a more basic way, this also means learning how to listen closely so that we can learn how to more feely feel our hurt so that we can begin the process of healing. So let us make no mistake, this is not easy work, nor should it be romanticized. Spaces like the African American Cultural Center, founded by Frederica Bay in Newark, are not easy to build. They literally require decades of personal investment, spiritual, financial, physical, and communal work. Worth having if it does not also include the freedom to make mistakes. Freedom is, the practice of freedom, I think, is a daily practice. It is exhausting, but it is invigorating. It replenishes the soul. It is hopeful, but that hope is tempered by the wisdom of remembrance, of legacies and boldness, creativity and risk-taking, and also community homemaking that continues to this very day. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Excellent. On behalf of 1DC, I also want to say thank you to the Social Justice Initiative for inviting 1DC and members of us to come out and talk to you guys and share with you what we're currently doing in DC. So as you guys all know, actually before I do that, because I'm a pop ed person, and even though it's a panel structure, I'm gonna have to be connected. Is that okay? So I got two questions for you guys. The first question is, how many of you guys know someone, a loved one, a friend, an enemy, who is currently paying more than half of their monthly income on housing? How many of you guys? I figured we'd popularize this statistic. All right, so the second question, how many of you guys know someone who is currently looking for work broadly defined, care work included, work that's life-affirming and life-sustaining? How many of you guys? I made it broad intentionally. So you guys are all reflections of what we are actually trying to fight for at 1DC in DC. As you guys know, all the statistics. We don't need to go down those statistics again for DC, but DC, just like New Orleans, is a laboratory for all of the neoliberalist projects towards social welfare reform, housing, jobs included. So as you guys know, workforce development is constantly the code word that politicians use to say this is how we're going to help the community. As you guys know, Barack Obama just did that recently a couple months ago with the black men, saying that this is how they can gain respect and inclusion and citizenship. So what we do is we organize long-time, low-income DC residents, but we also organize broader than that. We organize people like you. Anybody who self-identifies with the movement and believes that the world can be better and should be better. We organize with people who believe that we should be practicing for more than just the right to a house or the right to a job. We're actually organizing about structural alternatives. That's all we do. Every time we create a campaign, it's about us trying to push towards practicing what we think the world should actually look like now. So that means we're in love with housing cooperatives, worker cooperative, worker centers, et cetera, et cetera. For us, just like Ms. Nzili just said earlier, freedom is a practice. It's not a destination. It's not about just the right to choose whether or not to work in this neoliberalist system. It's just not about these choices that I think we tend to romanticize about the right to be treated the same as white people. We don't believe that, because at the end of the day, 1DC believes that we should be fighting against the existence of any system that justifies uneven development. The fact of the matter is, when you have wealthy communities, that means you will always have poor communities. We believe in a society that never exists, that type of difference never exists. So some of the ways that we go about doing this work is many ways, but we do it incrementally, but we also do it very intentionally. I'll share with you guys one example of how we fight towards a different society now. We're currently in a building, a residential building, where the owner opted out, what we call opt out, and terminated their Section 8, project-based Section 8 contract. And you guys probably know about project-based Section 8. It doesn't get talked about as much as public housing, but just like public housing, it's under attack. It was institutionalized in a way in the 70s, I think with Nixon, to normalize private ownership, but then also give government subsidy. And after 30 or 40 years, you can opt out of the contract. So this particular owner in DC, he will remain nameless unless you want to talk to me outside. I'll give you all the details so you never rent from him again. This particular owner thought it was best to opt out, transition in Shaw, where 1DC is headquartered, which is right next to Howard. It's like a mile away from Howard University. And he proceeded to go through transitioning all of the units that people moved out, gave people, the government actually, the federal government gave all the people who wanted to stay enhanced vouchers, but all the people who wanted to leave regular vouchers, and told the residents, you have the right, the choice, you have the freedom to move. So as you see here, freedom for us is not this neoliberalist concept of individually, you get out of the poor areas, go live near white people, and while we figure out how to gentrify the place that you just left. That's not the type of freedom we're talking about. So as he's doing this, he's telling the residents, I'm doing everything to protect you. So all of a sudden, he doesn't renovate the units that the residents have lived in for over 40 years. He tells them you will stay in the same unit even though you're technically paying more. He then says he renovates all the other units, puts granites, all that nice little stuff that we supposedly want in the urban luxury spaces, and tries to make them urban luxury apartments. But then he also starts telling the residents that you can't be out past 5 o'clock at night, and has the police there to make sure that they cannot sit outside. Tells them that actually you guys have been enabling criminal activity for the past 40 years, and now we're going to make sure the police arrest anyone who's in the playground. They tore down the playground, they make the children play in dirt, they tell the children they cannot throw footballs or soccer balls, while they allow some of the new people to play Frisbee, however late they want to, and congregate in the public areas however long they want to. Clearly, the residents know clearly, I'll keep this brief. I wanted to tell you the story because the residents want to know that they are basically imprisoned and they're being forced to make the choice to move. So we've been organizing with them to feel comfortable to go directly to the owner and tell the owner, you cannot treat us like criminals where we live. So that's about what we do. Freedom is practiced, and the basic reality that they are able to go to tell the owner and go to Germantown, where he takes their resources and their wealth, and tell him to his face, you cannot do that. That's what we do at 1DC.
Thanks a bunch. My name is Shayna Griffin, and I'm from New Orleans. I'm with the Women's South Injustice Initiative. Teresa, I'm going to try my best to look your way, just to be conscious of time.
I'll do this.
Okay, good. I work with an organization, the Women's South Injustice Initiative is a radical feminist of color organization based in New Orleans. And we was basically formed immediately after Hurricane Katrina. Our core, I guess, focus, I would say, is we're dedicated to improving the lives, improving the social and economic health and well-being of women and girls of color in the city. Freedom. When I think of freedom, I think of two things. One, I think of Toni Morrison's children's book, The Big Box. Have anyone ever read that? Yeah. Cool. It's a fabulous book. I think about this a lot because I have a 3-year-old and I read it to her often. I also think of, because of the topic of this panel, I think of comments made by Sharon Jasper, a former public housing resident in New Orleans that she made in 2007 in the city council chambers when she was among hundreds of activists and organizers attempting to communicate her opposition to the demolition of public housing. Several of us was able to enter into the city council chambers, and several others of us, hundreds of us, were not able to enter. Did you make it in?
I didn't make it in.
Yeah, I didn't make it in either. So I'm gonna get into that. But first, the Big Box. The Big Box is a beautiful story of 3 young people. One name is Patty, one name is Mickey, and one name is Liza Sue. And these 3 kids can't handle their freedom. In the book, and I don't want to give it all away, but they state, after being reprimanded for being themselves, they state, if freedom is defined just your way, it's not my freedom or free, right? So I want us to think about that, and then I'm going to cycle back to it in just a second. Ms. Sharon Jasper, when she made her comments in the city council chamber, she didn't make these comments directly to the city council itself because the chambers of the council had disrupted. And so she's in this argument, I would say, with a white man in the city council chambers. He's sitting down, she's standing up, and she's, moving her hand and, stuff like that. I'm going to read to you all her statements, but the way I'm reading it is not the way that she was talking. It was with much more emotion, much more anger. She states, I am tired of being disrespected. I am a black woman. If I gotta go to jail, if I gotta die for what I believe in, I will not be treated like a slave. I'm a human being, a United States citizen. So we're gonna backtrack right quick. The first thing she says, I'm tired of being disrespected. I'm a black woman. She's equating being black and being a woman with disrespect, first. Then she states, if I gotta go to jail or if I gotta die for what I believe in, I will not be treated like a slave. In that one sentence, she brings up 3 historical moments. People have gone to jail in a fight for freedom. People have been arrested, and people have died. And she's also a descendant of slaves. In each one of these instances, people was fighting for freedom, right? Then she says, I'm a human being, right? To be human, she says, to be free. And on top of being a human being, she says, I'm a United States citizen. So to be a U.S. citizen is above being human. And still, as a citizen of the United States, as a human being, as a descendant of enslaved people, her race, her gender, and her income status trump her right to be free and to exercise or to participate in a process, a democratic process, to voice her opposition. She's making these statements to this white guy, and as she's making this appeal to him, there's a YouTube video of it. I'm not sure she was aware that she was being recorded. He's commenting her, and she just, out of disgust, she goes, "Shut up, white boy, shut up," right? But with much more anger, right? But in saying that, it's just like, how do you know? Like, you're white, you're a boy, you know what freedom is. But a different way of thinking about this "shut up, white boy" is saying, but if freedom is defined just your way, it's not my freedom or free, right? And so when I'm good on time? Okay, so when we're thinking, so Ms. Jasper's comments is not about so much about a right to the city. It's more about our right to exist, right? And for those of us, like Ms. Jasper, and those of us who have either lived in public housing, who currently live in public housing, or who live in neighborhoods that's racially and economically segregated, when we see the demolition, not so much when we see the demolition, but when the buildings, public housing, when the buildings themselves remind people, like folks like Ms. Jasper, exist. And when those buildings are torn down, do we still exist? Okay.
You're a little past 5 minutes.
Okay, so there are several other things I wanted to say, but I'm gonna pause and hopefully I'll cycle back and I could keep going.
My name is Kali Akuno, and Shana just made me have a flashback to that moment in 2007, and that was a critical fight, one from which I still feel like I'm learning from and trying to adjust from in many respects. And quite honestly, which led to, at least in part, my part in the formulation of the Jackson-Kush Plan, some of the hard lessons from that particular setback. I wouldn't call it completely a defeat because the fight's not over, but from that particular setback, to regroup, rethink, where could we concentrate our limited time and energy in a place where we are strong to make some critical advances. And out of that, in this particular just so folks are clear, was just a cohort of strategy folks in the Malcolm X grassroots movement. We were thinking, we put a lot of time and energy into a couple of different things, and I think we gave it all we had, but it didn't turn out the way that we hoped that it would. And so rather than being kind of firefighters, jumping from here, jumping from there, where could we concentrate where we already had some strength? And it was out of that, in terms of looking, where we had a core group of folks at that time in Alabama, in Georgia, and Mississippi, where was our greatest strength and what was the greatest potential? And that was Jackson, Mississippi. And what we looked at was the relationships that have been built by the organization over a 40-year period, and how deep that they went into the community. And one of the ways that we wanted to we really wanted to test our strength, more so than at that point in time, and this is like 2008, 2009, we really wanted to run a campaign to test our strength, not necessarily to have Chokwe Lumumba win the electoral seat, which was first the city council seat. That wasn't the primary aim and objective. It was really to see us putting out our particular politics, our particular vision. If there's 15% of this particular ward that believes in what we're doing, that's a base from which we can operate from, a base from which we can build and move from. It turns out that we won. And then that enabled us to create some more anchors and put some things down and then try to make the mayoral run. But what we tried to do was dream big, with an understanding that we were not going to do everything perfectly, that we didn't necessarily have everything in our capacity to do that we wanted to do, but kind of pursuing this model that if we were going to fail, at least we failed better than we did the last time, right? And leave more of a legacy of people learning from our experiences to build upon, whether they're in Hattiesburg or New Orleans or wherever. That was part of what we were really aiming to do with the time and energy that we had. But we did have some real concrete objectives that we were trying to pursue to transform the lives of the people of Jackson. And through that, really looking at using that as a way to launch a broader campaign to transform the lives of what many of us call the Kush, which is a contiguous area of 18 counties that runs basically from Memphis all the way down to, basically almost down to New Orleans. Most of which is in the state of Mississippi. So we were really looking at that and trying to come up with a process of saying, well, what can we do in a 4-year period that would leave both a policy infrastructure and some basis for the social movements to pick up, create more space, create more room, create a bit more power for them to take up the torch and keep moving forward. And out of that, many of you heard me say that there were really kind of 3 things that we were looking at. Creating a human rights regime in the city, creating more participatory structures in the city through the budgeting process, the policing, and opening up more space for democratic vehicles within the community like the People's Assembly to exercise power and influence over the city. And then the one we thought was the most critical one was creating a foundation for the community to seize more control over the economic processes and production within the city through cooperative development. So that was really the kind of the grand experiment that we were instituting, and which we're still working on, albeit without control of the mayor's seat. But again, we understood that was transitory to begin with. We lost it earlier than we like to, but the social movement aspect of it lives on.
Hello. So let me start this way. I believe in the power of stories, and so I'm going to lift up some stories, and I think everybody at the table in some ways has started or enveloped a story into it, whether it's a story of someone else or their own story. Let me start by saying, what is freedom? What does it look like? What I articulated is freedom is generating the space and the conditions and mutual respect for people to express their fully creative human selves and live with dignity. I am the granddaughter of Nellie Frazier and the daughter of Virginia Nathaniel Williams Sr., and I'm the sister of Nathaniel Williams Jr. And I'm going to start with Hurricane Katrina, post-Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and I'm going to take you to Martha Benton in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullets and end. In September 2005, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the Wall Street Journal quoted Republican Congressman Richard Baker of Baton Rouge telling lobbyists, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did." While Baker extolled what he expressed as an ordained cleansing of the city's public housing and, it would seem, its residents, the urban theorist, activist, and author of Planet of Slums, Mike Davis, rendered a blistering critique of the earthly decisions that too often subjugate the public good to the market. Condemning the predators of New Orleans and their quote-unquote catastrophic economics, Davis stated, quote, "It is no secret that its business elites and their allies in City Hall would like to push the poorest segments of the population, blamed for high crime rates, out of the city. Historic public housing projects have been raised to make room for upper income townhouses and Walmart. The ultimate goal, it seems, to be a tourist theme park New Orleans with chronic poverty hidden away in the bayous, trailer parks, and prisons outside the city limits," end quote. Davis continued, "Not surprisingly, some advocates of a wider, safer city see a divine plan in Katrina. Over a year later, New Orleans housing officials had announced the demolition of 4,500, these are the stories you're hearing, the 4,500 government apartments. The natural or heavenly intervention asserted by Baker benefited from extraordinary earthly aid. Extremely concerned about residential displacement post-Katrina and future access to affordable housing in the city, public housing residents in New Orleans raised their voices, and they argued, as Davis had, that municipal officials did not want poor black people to move back to the city, period. Sharon Pierce Jackson, whose housing complex was slated for razing, declared, quote, "The day you decide to destroy our homes, you will break a lot of hearts. We are people. We are not animals." Real people, real stories. A story. Martha Benton, Baltimore housing resident, public housing resident. At 23 years old, the pregnant Martha Benton moved into a place called Somerset Courts in 1964 with her husband and 2 children. And at that moment, she felt shame. Shame. About 2 years later, she transferred to Douglas Homes, public housing, for a bigger apartment. And by then, she was raising 5 children by herself. And when I interviewed Martha Benton for the first time in 1996, she told me how she had experienced profound contradiction. She had no other alternative but to seek government help in the form of public housing. But those closest to her, including her mother and her father and husband, frowned on public housing, the projects. And Benton told me, she said, they always thought the people there didn't want nothing, didn't care about nothing, wasn't trying to achieve anything, and that it would take away any incentive that I might have to try to rise above the situation. And at the age of 36, after a number of unfortunate circumstances, including losing 2 children, one to death by a drunken driver, the other lured to the streets and murdered, after losing her job, taking sick, and having to live on medical disability, Martha Benton knew that it would be tough to survive without subsidized housing. And shaped by the activism of other black women tenants in public housing like Goldie Baker, Martha Benton decided to become active in her community, especially around youth. In June 2010, at the age of 68, Mrs. Benton died. Now, Sharon Pierce Jackson's and Benton's life experiences have revelatory power. I started with stories and their stories and my voice only in the lineage because stories have power, right? Their stories in particular have revelatory power. They shed light on how race and economics and gender and place intersect to make meaning and shape material reality. They shed light on what it means to experience marginalization and simultaneously strive for a decent life when different opportunities exist for some and are foreclosed to others. These women's voices from the margins of cities and urban history, and their voices that even we sometimes discount, the mothers, the brothers, the husbands, not the external folks that we always targeting, but the folks who are closest to us, expose the everyday travails of low-income people and political realities shaping their lives and communities. And they also reveal the shifting racial, political, and economic landscapes that shape citizens' disparate experiences of this thing that we call U.S. democracy. This thing we call U.S. democracy. Their voices in comparison to the simplistic, egregious, political, moralistic implications of God's cleansing away refuse exposes the intricate connections, the divergent realities, and the changes over time, thereby forcing us to think about the history of race and the interconnections between the state and place and urban policies and structural inequality and poor people's claims to human rights in the city. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because I'm almost out of time, but the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The stories of low-income African-American women help us to broach the topics of 1, governing logics, injurious perceptions, linked to economic imperatives and questions of humanness or humanity-driven policy or lack thereof. 2, who is missing from our tellings and understandings of urban space and its link to corporate power, privatization, and gentrification, and how the roles three of these women clarify or provoke our understanding of both, four, thereby forcing us to continue to reckon with power, and how it in fact does have, power does have, responding to some comments yesterday, power does have racial, gender, ethnic, class, economic, sexuality, age, spatial, ableist, etc., uniforms, modalities, articulations, and complex lyricism. 5, that give rise to the verses of oppression. 6, and make us pause to question what this means for our understanding of who has a right to the city. So it is about who we are listening to, whose experiences we value and honor and deem relevant and worthy, and how we transform that listening, and those stories into analysis and understanding and education, to use that to create agendas and to speak out and to contest and thereby bridge voicing to action. And I can talk about how we're doing that in Q&A. Thank you.
Well, as promised, the panelists delivered. So there are a number of things that I think are very important to point out, one of which is that there is this sort of beginning understanding of the structural inequality, the structural aspects to these issues, right, and the connection of these structural aspects to the economics and to the economic system. And so everyone here has come up with some different and at the same time very similar ways of approaching some of these issues. Everything from cooperatives to human rights agendas, participatory kinds of things, whether it's budgeting or in the decision making, finding safe spaces, creating safe spaces, telling stories, using stories as building power, and building the capacity of people to really deal with some of this. So what we want to do, because I know as organizers, we want this to be as interactive as possible, so I have a set of questions myself that I want to pose, but I think what we'll do instead is allow people to pose their questions, get some engagement here, and I'll allow the panelists to be able to even elaborate more on some of the details. So as you're preparing yourselves to ask a question, I'm going to pose one real quickly about the cooperatives. And if you can just speak a little bit real specifically about what it takes to get these cooperatives organized, because this is really a good strategy to deal with some of these economic issues that we face.
Well, thank you. It's extremely, I'm going to preface it by saying cooperatives, organizing period, but cooperatives specifically, practicing cooperative economics is extremely hard. We recently just completed a housing cooperative of predominantly Spanish-speaking Latino DC residents and some African Americans in about 3-4 years ago. It took, and Dominic is here, Dominic Molden, if you can raise your hand too so people can speak with you afterwards. It took several years just to get people clear about what practicing living in a cooperative and practicing cooperative economics means, right? Because a lot of times people assume that housing, you just go in, particularly a limited equity cooperative, which is what we do. All you have to do is just go in, live, pay your co-op fees, and that's it. Cooperative is a way of life. Like, you literally have to unlearn the ideology that as a subject position of being a tenant, that you pay your money and you give your wealth to someone else, and that other person decides what happens to your property. What we had to do through several different leadership development trainings, institutes, organizing, bringing them into the broader 1DC work that we do around liberation and decolonizing our minds around what happens with housing and jobs in the city. We really had to talk to them about how is it to relate to neighbors and do intentional relationship building work? How is it to deconstruct these ideas about black and brown antagonistic relationships? All those things take time. And that does not mean after we've done all those intentional workshop developments and all those pop-ed sessions that there's still not messy contradictions. The point of the matter is that we're continually grappling with them. The big problem too, and this is partly why we do broader housing work, particularly around the People's Platform, which when you guys go on the website, you'll see all the wonderful things we do. We did, that was the last cooperative we did because again, as you guys know, co-ops exist within a capitalist society, particularly a neoliberalist one. And they have been changing the definition of well, they haven't changed it. Let's say this. The definition of affordability is out of touch, right? So when we build these co-ops, we have to rely on government subsidy. Government subsidy is within every housing production. It's very hard to get out of it unless you're independently wealthy. We're not. So what we have to do now is actually go to the city council, talk to our neighbors and say, we need to demand a better reflection of what it means to be affordable. Because if we build housing now, if we build a limited equity cooperative in DC, people will be paying almost $1,000 plus out of their pocket for a one bedroom. Just because of the definition of affordability in the district is so egregiously high because it's based on this very crazy notion that DC, because we're not a state, we have to be lumped in with all these other municipalities that are crazy high. So those are some of the complications, but again, the victories are many because at the end of the day, there's a housing cooperative where longtime DC residents, people who come from all different nationalities are working together to preserve their space, to collectively control their resources and to make sure that their community is a reflection of what they desire. That's again why we practice our structural alternatives of housing cooperatives.
And since individualism is so much a part of neoliberalism, then to have something that's very collective helps really challenge the logic of that. So very nice. Go ahead, you have a question.
Yeah, this is awesome. I have a question, probably close to you. Oh, okay. My question is, I work in a community of homeless folks. And so it's very hard organizing people who are trying to get their basic needs met. Yes. So I'm really curious to what you're doing and what others have done in those sorts of communities where people are very much so on the hunt of going from agency to agency to agency all day, trying to find housing and other resources, and so very limited time for organizing.
Did anybody want to take that?
Well,
Although, can I just remind all the panelists that we do have simultaneous translation going on, and we always like to talk, like we sing and dance, right? But we're going to need to slow down a little bit for our translator.
clip, so I'll try to. I know, right? People who know me know that's my natural clip. I'll try to slow it down. Through the Social Justice Institute at Case Western Reserve, we actually are not engaged in kind of developing and delivering services. But I do know of an organization, Freedom Now, which is where some of the narrative that I talked about in terms of stories and why stories are important. Freedom Now is an organization, or is a book that was published by LA Can, and they actually do work around skid rows and homelessness. And they do political education, they do interviews, they do organizing of campaigns. So that might be an organization you can kind of look up and find more information. And they put all of this together, so they have people who are doing policy, people who are engaged in the process of trying to find stable, economically secure lives so they can actually exercise human dignity or have human dignity. Those who are actually trying to lift up those stories, they put them all together in these publications, and they use that as political education throughout the city in homeless sectors and quarters, as well as with folks who are actually trying to transform public housing policy. So I think it's kind of very unique in that way. So I actually contributed to that. One of the things that we do is we have a Voicing in Action project where we are co-partnering with a neighboring municipality to actually get people to talk about their distinct life stories, but also what it is they imagine for the present and the future, and then begin to think with them through how we actually translate that into action, so that it's not, so we're not forgetting people's experiences. They move from place to place and transition however they transition, but also begin to think about the specific issues around racism and inequality, and have those conversations where some of us don't think those conversations are relevant, and where people want to talk about it, and where they actually have something to say and actually educate us about, and then try to figure out how we translate that into action. So that's kind of where we are in the work that we're doing specifically around storytelling and voicing. But LA Can might be a good place.
Did someone else want to add to that? Go ahead.
Just briefly, and then I would also add, that is not particularly the Bach Center's lane, but we do a lot of collaborative work with organizations like Michigan Welfare Rights, Eviction Defense, Blue Babies, which specifically works with homeless teens and foster children who age out of the, Blue Babies. And so they do a lot of work working with young people who age out of the foster system and then don't necessarily have somewhere to go after that. So reiterating, like, what the Bach Center does is we're kind of like a hub for nurturing political leadership and transformational leadership that brings together all different entities to do the work. So in essence, we're like anti-silo from the root. So basically, we uplift organizations as well as do that collective work to build on our political education. So,
Go ahead. Sanzelli?
Okay.
And then Rosemary.
One of the things that's really important about Northside Women's Space is working with women who have engaged in survivor sex, and that just means trading sex for just basic kind of needs, whether it's housing, whether it's to eat, just basic needs. And one of the things we learned with the space, I mean, it's kind of conceived of as like a drop-in center, but it's not really that. It's a place where women can come and just be. So me and the women who we work with go from agency to agency. In Minnesota, it's full of all types of bureaucracies, pockets of money here. They give you the runaround and the runaround and runaround, you get nothing. But what we found with NWS is creating a way for, I mean, in any given week, it's like 10 to 20 women who may be there, time to think about what they want to do. One of the interesting things that we've learned is when I say trying to understand and listen to each other's stories, many of us have analysis, and this is one of the, a lot of times we think we need to politicize folks, but we really don't. They may not call it neoliberalization, they may not say race, gender, sex, but they have that whole analysis down. But what folks don't have is we haven't been able to deal with the trauma, right? We get information overload, so much disease, so many, I mean, these stories go over and over, so a lot of what we're doing in that space, we started, okay, we're gonna build together, right? But then it's like, well, what are we really doing? We need to heal, because if you build on top of wounds, then what do you have? What's your foundation? And so a lot of the work ends up being really trying to enable women, that includes myself, to simply have time to think and strategize about what we need for the center to be. And so the whole point about it taking years, we started meeting back in September in 2010, and it's gone on from there. Actually, first building this, refurbishing this whole church and making it into a center, but this takes years and years of building. So now we're in the third year, and this is what it is consistently. So yeah.
Rosemary? And then again, I just want to remind everyone about the translation.
I'm going to say this really quickly. So 1DC.
No, not quickly.
Quickly but slowly.
Say it quickly but slowly.
Yes. 1DC, we entered into, when we did organizing around the Marriott jobs that were being built, the Marriott that was being built right by the convention center, we organized, we entered the workforce development industry, which we know is a huge bureaucracy, because we're in the legacy of the Black Panther Party. We're in the legacy of the worker cooperatives that were started at the turn of the century by Black families who wanted to build their wealth, share their wealth and their resources collectively. So we decided to enter into the service industry because we wanted to mess it up. I was going to say something else, but I was just going to say mess it up. We outreach to over 1,000 people because you know what? Most of our folks do need jobs, but we want jobs that are life affirming, right? So we went into the service economy. We said, okay, y'all keep saying the poor people only need service jobs. We're gonna go in there and we're gonna we got to contact with 1,000+ people. Now we're working, because most of them were not hired because of respectability politics and all these things that were discussed earlier. But we said, we haven't forgotten about you. We've gone back now and we're building relationships with them again to get them to think about what would a worker center look like? What would a worker cooperative look like? We got the resources. So instead of us waiting for us to negotiate how to work with the service nonprofits and all these direct service entities, why don't we go in and start messing stuff up? Interjecting ourselves so that we show how direct services needs to flip its head and think about transformative work. Then we start, with our work that we're trying to do now, we're talking about wellness. We're talking about what transformative relationships look like, how we start with ourselves, but wellness is more than just an individualistic enterprise. It's not more than just doing yoga. It's about wellness in terms of a holistic understanding, economic, spiritual, mental, all these different dimensions. But again, these things are practiced and it's over time. So we teach people patience as well, which is also tough for me to practice.
So your concept of wellness is wonderful, right? And you also mentioned this notion of interjecting yourselves. So Collie and his buddies down in Jackson are bold enough to interject themselves into a whole range of arenas, including the one that we know has limitations, but also yields all kinds of possibilities. So if you can speak a little bit more about the balance or about the relationship between the electoral world and the grassroots world, and how you even see them working together to create more possibilities. And as you do that, you can also talk about participatory budgeting and the participatory decision-making.
Well, let me make one thing clear. Our model, we believe at this point, only works within a specific context. We could not do and did not envision doing some of the things that 1DC is doing.
So context matters.
Context is very important. See, Mississippi and Jackson, even though it's the capital of Mississippi, is very wealthy, but it's capital deprived, right? And you got to make a distinction between the two. There's a ton of community wealth in the social relationships and the social bonds and the organic community that's there. Jackson is still one of the places where, you know, the great-grandmother and the grandchild are still living in the same house, still living in the same block, still living in the same community. And we're talking about throughout the entire city. It's like that. That makes certain things in terms of organizing much easier than what you got to face in D.C. or what you have to face in Atlanta. There's a lot of built-in things already that are there that you just really pulling from the community, and sometimes trying to settle old beefs, or you know, just getting this one to talk to that one, etc. Doing some healing work. That is kind of some of the core. Then the political agenda really flows from there. I think that the thing that what we have really just tried to interject into the conversation is this last point. That being, look, we are in a situation, there's no major industry going to come to Mississippi, not immediately, and particularly not to Jackson, because you know Nissan is up the road in Canton, but technically the way that they've written that, Canton is actually, or at least that Nissan plant, that's part of, that's Japanese territory, right? When you walk into the plant, there's a little sign, if you pay attention, that says "Welcome to Japan." Right, and they've signed a lease where that plant is not even paying taxes to the city of Canton. It won't have to do so for like 98 more years, right? So, and they're already in a situation that because of the organizing work that the UAW and the community partners are putting into, they're talking about uprooting that plant. And more than likely, I think they're serious about if it does, you know, unionize, and hopefully it will, that they'll shift production somewhere else, right? So we've been trying to deal with the reality that we have to fight that fight. We encourage it, we support it 100%. But we're in a context where we're gonna have to create our own livelihood in many respects. And what we have with the community wealth, there's plenty of land and there's plenty of skill. We have to figure out how to pool that community wealth and direct it to become capital assets that we can, you know, barter, trade with, you know, on an international level. See, one of the things that we know that previous generations do not have, we have the ability, because of the way globalization is, and I'm not an advocate of of globalization. Don't get me wrong. Don't get it construed. But we know we have more friends in the Caribbean than we got throughout the entire state, just given the nature of what Mississippi is still at present, right? And we can get more favorable terms of trade elsewhere in the world that we can get next door in Pearl or next door in and we have the means because of the transportation, because of the technology to be able to do so. So we've been trying to think out of the box in terms of what are the resources and the skills that are already there. How do we collectivize that and utilize that as our strength and not have to rely on this bank or that bank? If we want to negotiate with them, we do so from the basis of strength of our own organizing.
Yeah, well said, well said. Shauna, did you want to add to that? Shauna?
Oh,
Yeah.
Shayna.
Shayna,
It's
sorry.
fine, yeah. There was a couple of things I was thinking. First is, well, I don't know if I, never mind.
Sorry, I saw you move the mic forward.
Oh, no,
I didn't mean to
was.
put you on the spot.
Holly said something, I was like, oh yeah, I wanted to make this point, and
I saw the moving of the microphone,
yeah,
right?
the microphone closer.
But I think this whole idea of the asset base, right, pulling together the resources and the pieces of and the various aspects of the wealth, and taking control of that to develop strategies. That's very powerful. Did you think of it, Shayna?
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking about how, like what you're describing, how do we seize the opportunity, and also how do we put it in context, right? I feel like there's a lot of organizing that takes place in New York, places like here in Chicago, places in New York, places in the Bay Area, that looks very different below the Mason-Dixon line, right? And so in the city of Jackson, even in Mobile, Alabama, something that like rent control could take almost 20 years, and in some places it could take 5 or less, or it may already exist, right? So I think it's very important that we think about the context, but also how do we seize the opportunity and commit ourselves to taking risk. After Hurricane Katrina, I found myself in a situation that I helped open up a women's health clinic. Overnight, literally overnight, I had to learn everything about everything in terms of medical liability, legal issues, Medicaid, getting an NPI number, and also thinking about, and also struggling with what does it mean to open up a women's health clinic, how to prioritize a women's health clinic in a context where everybody is saying that is not a priority, getting people back home, go find our people, housing, education, working, right? How to hold that space, but also how to recognize that without prioritizing your health and well-being, you cannot come home, right? But being willing to take the risk and operationalize our politics, and struggling with the ways in which it may look different in your mind than when you're unrolling it, right? How to commit yourself to a social justice politic while at the same time recognizing you can be sued because we're talking about someone's health and well-being. Even in the context of housing, I just recently, over 5 years now, helped start a community land trust, a neighborhood-based community land trust, thinking about what you were describing in terms of limited equity housing cooperatives, but also thinking about what does it mean to have shared equity, like being stewards of the land, right? But there's this whole politic around that, right, which is great, but then there's real issues around discrimination, like housing discrimination, and it's not illegal to discriminate against people based on their income, because income is not a protective class of fair housing laws. But recently I recognized too that when we're talking about housing or the right to the city, advocating for housing affordability is not enough, right? We have to be thinking about housing rights, but in the context of changing demographics, especially in a city like New Orleans, rapid neighborhood changes in terms of displacement, gentrification. Also, we have to avoid using gentrification and displacement as if they're the same, because they're very different. People confuse that all the time, but how to engage in this work, be willing to take these risks, and be willing to, like you were saying before, learn from those mistakes, right?
That's great, and I want to come back to this issue of taking risks and what that involves, but let me go ahead and get some more questions from the floor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shayna.
You're welcome.
Am I on? Yeah. Well, I came to this workshop with very, very specific needs, and those needs were, number one, to find out what is happening around the rest of the country in terms of combating gentrification, and also because there's a lot of, I'm a poet by trade, and there's a lot of semantic finessing that goes along on the municipal level in terms of how they describe it. They describe things as redevelopment of the community. And they put out these beautiful things like, oh, we're going to put more parks. And in Chicago, we've got this new thing where, oh, we're going to take over neighborhood, but we're going to put some community gardens out there. So my first question is, how do you combat semantic arguments? And the second question is a little bit far-reaching. I see a lot of, a few years ago, we had a lot of discussion around foreclosure and in terms of banks subsidizing people to fail. And it strikes me as interesting that a lot of those banks that gave people loans that they knew they would never be able to pay are now owning these properties that are being foreclosed. And I'm just wondering if that's if you're seeing that across the country, and what do we do?
Holly, you want to go first?
I'll try. First, you got to create your own narrative.
That's
I
right.
mean, I'm sure you've heard that before, but I do think that's important. I don't think that simply entails changing this word or substituting that word. I think you have to speak specifically to the needs of your community and what you're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And it's most important that your community, and in my experience in Jackson, our experience in Jackson, that your community understands what you're talking about more so than anybody else.
That's right.
You know, that's the most important piece of the whole game, I think, to me. And once folks understand, okay, you fighting for this, I can get down with that.
Mm-hmm.
We exist in a context in Jackson where we've been demonized by certain forces in the state for the Jackson Kush Plan piece that we've put out. And one of the things we've constantly stressed is that there's a group of developers who came together and put together this thing called Plan 2022. You can look it up online.
Mm-hmm.
And we put out all the time, y'all got your plans? You know, y'all not ashamed to put out what y'all believe. This is what we believe.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we about. This is what we fighting for. We don't have no shame in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then speaking of our narrative, y'all want to learn our language, cool. If y'all don't, that's fine. We're going to do what we need to do in terms of trying to organize the community to have the power we need to carry our vision forward, right? And that helps us to kind of stay out of certain types of stale debates. Mm-hmm. But it's also a product of our environment, to be honest with you, so you got to be careful with that because, you know, the deindustrialization and a certain form of displacement hit Jackson in the 80s. Mm. And it's largely been, you know, there's like 20,000 vacant properties in Jackson. And to give you a sense of just where it is, you know, we've just completed one neighborhood project of having a small capital campaign that was about $40,000. That purchased about 56 houses or 56 houses in vacant lots. That's how cheap it is, you know, in certain neighborhoods in Jackson. But there is a gentrification that's coming, and we've known it is coming. So our thing was to try to get ahead of it as much as possible and change some of the facts, the conditions on the ground. That's the struggle that we are trying to engage in. Was not just about narrative, but also, you know, putting the forms of development we want in place to be able to contend with, you know, capital and the games that it's going to play in our area.
Mm-hmm. Does somebody else? Yeah. Tawana and then Rosemary.
So as far as the combating it, the gentrification and some of like maybe the media images that we use, I want you all to look up a video called The Albert. And so what it does is it juxtaposes the commercial beautiful images that are being used to show what this new beautiful property is going to look like for the new residents that are going to come in. And so at the same time as showing the residents who have been displaced to put those new residents in. And so it's a very powerful video that we circulated very, very widely, and it got national attention about what was really going on. And so I want to piggyback off of Kali about the narrative. I think we have to be careful about what role we play in this dominant narrative that exists, because we're constantly uplifting the very same information that we're fighting against. And so people feel hopeless and helpless, and they feel like they have no options to fight against these counter-revolutionary forces that we're up against, but the people that are fighting for their behalf are giving them the same information that those other forces are giving them. So I think sometimes it's, like when I used to work in fast food as a teenager, my boss used to always tell me to put a smile in my voice. Sometimes they don't need to hear about that other thing. They need to hear about what we're doing to create a new world. A new world is actually already happening. And like one of my mentors, Reverend Nelson Johnson, says, you can feel the rumble. Just pay attention. People know what's going on, like my sister here said. They know what's going on in the community. You don't have to tell them what's happening to them. They know what's happening to them. What you do have to share with them is what they can do about it. And that's not the conversation that we're having.
Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. First thing that's really kind of prevalent in Minneapolis and also in St. Paul is this building of bike lanes, right? And so people love to talk about, how great it will be to ride from this part of the city to another part. But one of the ways in which we're seeing gentrification work, particularly in Minneapolis and to a lesser extent St. Paul, is through these kind of, I call them white lanes, right? These lanes where you see, where property values that are clustered around these bike lanes automatically go up just because they exist. Thank you for that. The other thing I want to talk about is these light rail stations that's going up in St. Paul, down University Avenue. I-94, which is this kind of highway that went up back in the 1960s, cut through the Rondo community, which is a historically black community, but now we have the bike lanes going through there, and people organize around it and against it, and a lot of that organizing work really rests squarely upon the collection of these different types of histories in Twin Cities. Now, there are organizations like Neighborhoods Organizing for Change to do different things and do take different actions, occupy homes, but what I see consistently in Minneapolis, in a place where less than, and I'm talking about Twin Cities, 8% of all businesses are African American owned, a very tiny amount, is that the collection of those stories through art and through storytelling is the primary means of I see a sustainable resistance inside that city. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to raise in terms of what's happening. And I also think a lot about struggle art, which is specifically the collection of those stories and to holding those things. With that said, it's not enough, right? We're still on a losing end of it, but I also believe that the reclamation of public space through the arts and the telling of these stories through the arts, whether it's through hip hop and other means, is one of the primary ways in which folks have resisted, particularly in the Twin Cities area. So.
Well, and so much of fighting gentrification is in asserting ownership,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's ownership through the representations, the art kinds of things, or whether it's ownership through the purchasing of the houses, and then even what Kali was talking about, that sense of ownership of even defining what you think the future ought to be. So all of those kind of are part of, and as well as many others.
Can I jump in?
On gentrification.
I
Go
want to
ahead.
jump in and just kind of lift up what everyone's lift up in terms of the stories and the narratives, creating your own narrative, telling stories. I mean, in some ways, it can become something that folks say, well, that's a nice thing to do, but what about structure? Why we need to talk about stories, gathering people's stories, all that good stuff, hearing what people have to say. But I really think that if you think about the ways in which stories explode, can implode, can shift us from the governing logics,
That's right.
the mental logic. See, because policy can't happen unless it's driven by some logic. And I think stories and ways that people tell stories, whether it's the stories of people on the session or the stories of people who are coming into community centers or the stories of people who are engaging in struggle or whatever it is, can begin to not only help us imagine something different, but lift up, and I'm going to say lift up and hear the voices that are already out there, because yes, people already know what it is shaping their communities, but sometimes we don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
Like those of us who trying to do the work or think we're doing the work don't know, right? And so part of it is about us getting an education while we do that, but part of it too is like, how do you think about using those stories of people in community, the real stories, the narratives of their history, how they changed over time, how they did changes over time, how they forced changes over time.
Slow down.
I'm sorry.
I know, it's the
You
rhythm,
know,
right?
to model organizational change,
That's right.
to model the ways in which they had stick-to-itiveness, to model institutional transformation and the potential of that, right? And then to organize a community around those stories. So one of the things that we have done is, after we gathered some of the stories with our community partners in the neighbor municipality with a community organizing organization, the Northeast Ohio Alliance for Hope, then we had community dialogues about why were these stories important, and listen to your own people, your quote unquote own people tell the stories, and how they are also engaged in dealing with abandoned and vacant housing, understanding notions of foreclosure, trying to tell the difference between gentrification and displacement. So one of the arguments has been, well, you know, we're not being gentrified because we got plenty of abandoned and vacant property. But you don't have to be moved to be gentrified out of existence. You can live right next door to something and be gentrified out because you don't have access to it, right? So who has a right to the city? What is the city being built for whom to do what? Right? And so I think some of those, harnessing some of that, and then creating the narrative, translating that into agendas, but also taking that to municipal leaders who are not on your side and saying, this is what we think about this word development. I think sometimes we have to interrogate what it means by development, because I think sometimes we reinscribe the neoliberal space. Right? And when I say we, I'm talking about all of us doing the organizing, think we're doing the organizing, trying to do what we can in the way we can, right? So we're out there pushing for economic development. Not a bad thing. But like, what do we mean by that? Because people already own that. And so how are we going to use and empower that frame to do what we want to do, and what does that mean in terms of the actions that we have to engage in against power? The only other thing I want to say, I know, is that I think stories for me are important, and I continuously talk about them, and I think we need to interrogate our own stories and how we move through the world. But I think one of the things that we don't do as much work on, personally, I'm going to say, not personally me, but I'm just saying from my space, is we don't interrogate our own kind of classist, gender, sexist assumptions around folks in our own community, or how we deem people worthy or unworthy. So, when I'm talking about women in public housing, some people want to hear that, and some people don't, right? And when you talk about a right to the city, and you're talking about women in public housing, or families in public housing, or the demise of public housing, folks say, well, that just needed to go anyway. Well, yeah, I mean, the ways in which it ended up, maybe some of it needed to go, but like, what does that mean in terms of actual controlling of space, economic security, stability, how we define what affordable is, if it's $1,000 rent? Like, what? So some of us we don't even want to deal with that. And then, so how do we reinscribe that neoliberal moment? So how do we not unpack the structures and not deal with the structures? Oh, how does our work do that? Like, how does our work actually get us outside of and dealing with the systems and structures that continuously reinscribe by not dealing with our own internal dynamics?
So we've got several questions that come up on the floor. Shana, if you can hold that for just a second. And I'm going to just applause, thank you for our transcribers. Give them a chance to take a break here. Applause for the transcribers. I don't know whether people realize we actually have some visitors here from Havana. From Havana, no, I know from Cuba, but in Havana, right? So, gracias por venir. Bienvenidos. Okay, señora.
I am just very stimulated by this and hope that I'm not wasting I have both a question and a statement. The question revolves around whether or not you all have already discussed the use of communications and media, particularly alternative media, as a means of educating in both the internal education as well as the external. I came out of a situation in Atlanta, Georgia, where we organized through the universities and through the high schools using public access television, a powerful community radio station, a powerful youth-based stations that were on college campuses, Clark Atlanta University, Emory, and so forth. Satellite, grassroots satellite that was radical, and public forums to get us all on the same page repeatedly.
Yeah.
Not just one time, here's the issue, but repeated, here's the issue, and also telling people from this forum, go forward, here's the solution. Go to the FCC, write to FCC, and tell them blah, blah, blah. So that 100,000 emails came out of that situation that changed policy. So it is a powerful tool, particularly when it's rooted in university and community. And I wondered if that was indeed one of the things you did. The second piece, let me just say the second piece on that.
No, go ahead.
Second piece on that is that it's very connected to the self-employment arena. And I don't know if you've already talked about this,
Okay.
but I came out of the Women's Self-Employment Project, which started in Minneapolis, but second project is here in Chicago, Connie Evans, who showed and told how low and moderate income Black women, it started with women, were the people that held up the sky, who already knew what they knew and knew how to do it, just didn't know how to do it as a business, and had all kinds of wonderful businesses going. One of the things that occurs to me is that there's an example in West Virginia called AceNet that takes the indigenous people's ability to sew, do quilts, whatever, collectivized it, then uses the internet to sell their products all over the world, whether it's jams, jellies, or whatever. It is something that, as soon as the brother said it about that you all own the land and the skills in Jackson, Mississippi, my ancestral home, I can really see something like that coming out. So those are the two directions I'd love to see, whether or not you all know if there are really useful things that are being done in terms of anti-gentrification and pro-economic development that can be done or is being done.
Thank you. Those are both really great contributions to the conversation. And I know Tawana is chomping at the bit to respond to the self-employment one. But first, what I want to do is get the other question on the floor, and then respond to that which strikes you most that you want to respond to. So go ahead. Let's get 3 or 4 more questions out.
Hi, my name is Jackie Rodriguez. And so my question was for anybody who wants to answer. A lot of you were speaking about how you teach you're always teaching the community, or we gotta teach how to interact with Black and brown folks and all that jazz. So I was just wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about the curriculum and how you kind of approach that. And also I was just wondering, is that curriculum documented as well? And the reason why I'm asking that is because as I'm sitting here, I'm a history teacher, so I wish this is what I'm teaching in my classroom. If I didn't come to this conference, I wouldn't have known about your all organizations. I wouldn't have known that they existed. And yeah, so that's kind of I don't know, it was just so much going on. It's a beautiful panel. And also I'm really curious about the Black and brown leaders team and the housing. Especially in the city of Chicago, we have a huge issue with Black and brown folks. And especially, I'm Mexicana, so the majority of the students that I teach are Mexicanos, and so it's kind of a sad thing to see these communities not unified as they should be. Because one of the main things I teach in my classroom is that, you know, us having civil rights in this country could not have happened without the Black experience in this country. So that's something that I make sure to state. So I was just, you know, wondering how.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I saw four more hands go up right there.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if anybody in your experience worked with youth and what that looks like in terms of engaging youth-adult partnerships as, you know, equally respected voices and young people particularly as stakeholders in those communities.
Okay, great. Nice succinct statement. We got one right there and then one back over there. You know, one of the things as we're getting to, I just want to remind people too, you know, we've mostly focused on African American communities and strategies. We sometimes forget that Chicanos, Mexicanos, indigenous people, Puerto Ricans, other Latinos have been part of cities for as long as we've had cities in this country and even before that. So, and what the other thing we've had is we've had a lot of Black Latino alliances during the Chicano movement, for example, during the Puerto Rican movement. We had a lot of connection, a lot of coming together. So I think your point about the Black Latinos today becomes really important, and I think immigrant rights issues are certainly one way we come together, but we've had a long history of coming together around urban issues and around struggles together. So go ahead, ma'am.
Hi guys, my question is, what do you guys think about CDCs, community development corporations, and their work with building affordable housing, right? Affordable. And just is that a useful strategy against gentrification? Or just, I guess, what are your overall thoughts about CDCs and their work with housing, right?
Great. Okay, we got one right behind you, and then one over here, and those will be the last two questions. And then we're going to let panelists respond whichever direction they want to take their response. And that'll get us close to the end.
I'm also an educator, and I was interested in hearing your ideas on how we could bring back the whole ideas like the school as like a community hub where like lots of things happen and there was a lot of engagement, students were involved, and the parents were involved, and I feel like we're losing that in a lot of ways, especially in the city of Chicago. So like using the school as like a space to create that voice, to create that energy and that effort within communities, and like how we can best engage that. Because I feel like education and educators aren't being used in the ways that we can, because we have access to large amounts of people for large amounts of the day. So it would be, I'd love to hear how we could best use our voice.
These are all fantastic questions, but I feel like we're just starting to really rock and roll here. One last question in the back, and then what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is not necessarily have to answer everything, but pick and choose and incorporate that into whatever other comments you sort of want to make, and I'll start with Tawana and go down. Last question.
Sure. I probably should have asked this earlier, but the way that this has been discussed has been particularly urban, city specific. I'm wondering how this notion of a right to the city changes with the suburbanization of many of these urban problems, one. And then two, what does the sort of reverse migration of African Americans out of what we think of as urban northern centers back to southern cities, how does the right to the city struggle change in that space? Because I think that some of us conceptualize a lot of these struggles in northern spaces, but what do some of these urban struggles, I know DC is sort of in the middle of that, but what do some of these struggles look like south? So how do the suburbs and southern cities fit into this framework?
Well, right on. These are fantastic questions. Really great. Tawana, let's start with you.
So I will leave the CDC and the suburban question to some of my other panelists. But as far as the media thing goes, I want to uplift allied media projects in Detroit and encourage people to look into them and try to make your way to Detroit. But really quickly, so what we're doing in our neighborhood is we've developed what's called a mesh network. So we utilize residences and businesses that have the internet, and we put, they're kind of like routers on the roofs of other homes that don't have internet. And so we've just started that process, and it's in a huge area of the east side, where is our first focus. And so we're all collaborating on sharing the internet. And some of the things that are going to come out of that, particularly for senior citizens, is going to be like an intranet that allows us to communicate for emergencies and things like that. So that's one of the things that we're doing to communicate. I would also like to uplift our New Work, New Culture conference that I happen to be the coordinator for. And the reason why I want to uplift that is because we hate the term jobs, because jobs are so discriminatory from the onset. It does not and has never been supportive of every human being. And so we want to talk about work and culture and how every individual can bring something to the table. So the website for that is reimaginingwork.org. And so another invitation to Detroit. If you can't afford it, don't worry about it, come anyway. And then one more thing as far as education, I would like to uplift again Detroit Future Youth Network, which they have come together with 12 different youth organizations to do work to combat the school to prison pipeline, to provide education on things that they don't get in their school system, to start freedom school type educational environments, and to just combat some of the structures that are militarizing them. And so, it's a long, long list, but I would just encourage everyone to look into those at least 3 things
So I just got
for Detroit.
and I just got the word too that we do need to start wrapping. So I'm going to ask people to do kind of more bulleted comments. But as we're doing that, I also want to add another invitation to Detroit. Praxis Project is hosting Roots and Remedies in Detroit, middle of July.
And the Box Center is part of that.
All right, so let's hear it for Praxis Project in the house. Go ahead, Zinzuli.
So really briefly, I want to talk about the question racial coalition and the possibilities of that in Twin Cities. First, I would say particularly Minneapolis, South Minneapolis especially, has a very large and vibrant population, a large and vibrant Chicano population, particularly Mexicano. But I think that one of the more fruitful ways in which this is materialized in the Twin Cities is through hip hop, whether it's hip hop dance, whether it's through graffiti, whether it's through the music and production end. But I would like to say that hip hop in Twin Cities is extremely diverse, and it also creates really important opportunities for organizing and also creating possibilities for storytellings across difference. With that said, there's only the first African-American bookstore in Twin Cities in about 15 years is being opened up. And so in some kind of crazy way in Twin Cities, people of African descent, particularly the descendants of slaves, have been under kind of a continual onslaught, to the extent that it's been very difficult for us to create community spaces that actually affirm Blackness without having to apologize it. And that's just one of the kind of peculiarities about Twin Cities. What I would say about the CDCs, particularly in Twin Cities, Minneapolis especially, and also St. Paul, they have been collaborators with developers under this idea of, so you get the buy-in from the CDC.
If you can slow down a little bit.
Yeah.
So even when I tell you guys make your points, I know that usually that translates in our brain to say it really quickly.
Yeah.
But
So there are collaborators with, I think they're collaborators often with capitalists, particularly in the construction of light rails in the city. So I would just leave that there. But what I would also kind of just end with is that it's about creating sustainable relationships within cities. I think that we often forget that cities are homes, home places, and that if we are going to try to transform cities or reimagine cities and reimagine spaces in the cities, then we need to be attentive to the folks who are there and who have committed their lives to being in that place for decades, if not entire lifetimes. And I'll end there.
well said, thank you. Go ahead, Rosemary.
All righty then. I'm going to address 2 points, 2 questions that were raised. One about the CDCs. 1DC was originally a CDC. We were associated with MANA. We were MANA CDC. And we transitioned because we felt it was absolutely necessary for us to agitate more intentionally against the structural forces that reproduce the inequities that create the CDC, that then all of a sudden create the need for a CDC. So as you guys probably know, or probably will find out when you go on our website, we define equitable development to mean that we don't just focus on the cities. Although DC was born out of the age when DC was a majority African Americans, we recognize that uneven development exists everywhere. And like I said earlier, the concentration of wealth in our society allows the reproduction of these uneven spaces. So 1DC, and we literally, it's very apropos you brought up that question, because 1DC, we literally at lunch yesterday started having a very intentional conversation about what does that mean for the future of 1DC, because as uneven development expands, and as more of our diasporic Black people and colored people, non-white people, move to these peripheries, what does that mean for city-based organizing? Yes, there will still be thousands of Black people, still Black and brown, and other people still in an uneven spatial location in the city. It's expanding. So that means that we have to rethink our strategies. And that means we have to rethink more intentionally what our end goal is. Because it's just about trying to transform housing or jobs or different issues, education, but not really getting to more of the systemic issues, because all they do is cycle us over and move us to another space, then how do we do that? So that's a longer conversation which we'll love to have.
Thank you.
I want to end my comments on something I was hoping I can cycle back to, particularly as it relates to a lot of the work that I'm doing. And Rhonda, when you spoke, it brought it all back up. And I feel like there's ways in which when we talk about housing, our cities and land use, there are particular ways in when the experiences of women of color, especially poor women, gets marginalized. So I want to just take my remaining time not to respond directly to the questions that was posed, but just to share a little more information on some of my work that I was hoping to come back to lift back up. The first is over the past 7 years, particularly as a result of Hurricane Katrina, I'm gonna keep it slow, a lot of my attention has been focused on the intersections of reproductive violence and social policies, particularly as it relates to housing and land use policies in the context of disaster and climate change. Basically policies that make people disappear, similar to what you was just describing. And when I'm say the phrase reproductive violence, I'm referring to the methods used to sustain reproductive oppression. And reproductive violence is not simply about access to abortion, right? And by the methods, when I say methods used to sustain reproductive oppression, I'm referring to policies, laws, initiatives, behaviors, and procedures designed specifically to reduce, to control, and or to eliminate the reproductive autonomy of marginalized communities, and actions and belief and practices geared towards regulating and repressing our sexuality. In this work, one of the things that I have noticed a lot that has come up is that looking at there are various ways in which reproductive violence is embedded and manifested in housing policies. Not just housing policies. Throughout my research, I can see these things coming up as it relates to prisons, conditions of confinement, welfare policies, climate change policies, as well as sexual and reproductive health policies. But one of the things that I'm knowing is that the women of color and queer folks of color who are disproportionately impacted by housing discrimination are also targeted by campaigns to seek to control their fertility and criminalize their reproductive capabilities. Whenever there's an article locally in New Orleans, and I've seen this in other parts of the country, that references Section 8 voucher holders, or public housing residents, or low-income communities, you always see comments about welfare, comments about they're having too many litters. You always see it. For example, this is a quote from a newspaper article, a comment. The housing units discussed had 1 or 2 bedrooms. If occupancy standards are enforced, the highly fertile element will not live there. Still, population growth will adversely affect all of us. So those who oppose it have to have every right to do so. Another example, not until black ministers start teaching morals and ethics to their own so they don't have litters of pups like animals, and they're not milking the system. Like there's always these assumptions and these stereotypes. I see this so much, I developed this concept called population control policies of everyday life. I would love to go into it, but that's a whole nother session. But one of the things I just want to end with is that when we look at housing policies in the intersection between race and gender, this is what I see. There's a disproportionate utilization of public and subsidized housing programs among women of color and poor women. There's gender disparities in high-cost subprime mortgage lending. There's overrepresentation of poor women of color in eviction proceedings, residing in segregated and divested neighborhoods. Women and queer folks, I'm seeing women and queer people's elevated risk of vulnerability to poverty due to housing costs and discrimination. There's a pervasive nature of gender-based violence in the context of both accessing, securing, and maintaining one's housing, as well as, the examples that I gave. She's so cute.
Thanks.
The perceived fertility of women of color as an underpin to their affordable housing opposition. Last thought is, as it relates to gentrification and the comments I made about affordable housing is not enough. I was at a meeting and we were talking about affordable housing, increasing affordable housing, and I realized talking about affordable housing is important, but that does not equate to security of tenure. Nor does affordable housing, the creation of more affordable housing, guarantee tenant rights laws. So when we're talking about gentrification or ways to combat that, we have to be thinking about how do we create a more affordable housing, looking at limited equity housing cooperative models, looking at community land use models, but we also have to be thinking about what are the housing or the tenant laws that exist. How do we use existing code enforcement policies that improve rental qualities? How do we call for inclusionary zoning policies, right? I feel like there's...
So when you come a long way and you got a lot to say.
A lot to say.
And the time is short.
Right, hold on. But I just want to just say that I don't want the experiences of women of color, poor women, queer folks to be marginalized in the context of talking about housing and land use and how we are fighting for the right to the city. That's it.
Right on. Colleen.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think one thing that we have to really be mindful of in this period, it seems to be a generalized pattern that finance capital is really trying to push oppressed people out of the urban cores and into exurbs where there are no or very little infrastructure. And that is something I think we're going to have to figure out, because I think it poses some major peril in the area where, since finance is so dominant on the global scale and nationally, and it has no interest in stimulating productive activity that translate into employment or to jobs, that means we're going to be kind of out there doing who knows what, and they could care less, basically. So that's something I think we got to think deeply about. And then I think the last thing I'll just comment on, that you were talking about, kind of the in-migration in. We have to be, I think all of our communities, I can just locate myself being a person of African descent. We got to be very careful not to repeat some of the negative dynamics of quote-unquote growth and redevelopment that took place in Atlanta, that really antagonized, class contradictions within the black community very intentionally, and was very much predicated upon the destruction of public housing. Atlanta was the first city to have public housing and the first city to have it totally gone. And that is not by some coincidence relative to the class structure within the black community, which help foster and support the deconstruction of public housing for its own economic gain and, to a certain extent, political gain. And just the last thing I'll end on, I think the United States empire has always been a place of great diversity. It just may not have been a place always of concentrated diversity. Now we exist in an area where there's more concentrated diversity. Now what do I mean by that? So, Puerto Ricans have been in the United States, forcibly often. for well over 200 years, Cubans, Haitians, etc. Half of the United States at one point in time was Mexico. Least we forget. So the communities have kind of always been here, but not necessarily been here in such a manner until about 30, 40 years ago, and increasing, where they had enough political density, enough numbers to constitute a political force. And the communities themselves got used to, we got used to political arrangements that kind of developed out of the 60s. And we're still acting as if that reality in those numbers and that kind of distribution of power, however uneven it was, should still be the equation, and it oftentimes forces us to not seek coalition outside of our own communities, as opposed to, we got enough strength to kind of do it ourselves and go it alone. That only makes sense if you're trying to maintain just a small piece of the empire, as if it was yours to kind of carve up. It doesn't really make any sense to kind of maintain that mentality or that worldview. That's the last thing I'll say.
Yeah. Everybody's saying such incredible things. Go ahead, Rhonda.
So I want to say just a couple things. One is I'm going to say, I always have to say, if you can, get the politics of public housing. Because for me, it's not about me publicizing my book. It's about me keeping the women's words alive. And they actually engage in a lot of these conversations through their narratives, and I'm sure there are a lot of ways in which one could do that and one read that. But please, sometimes books go out of print and they sit in library shelves and they're not in the streets where they need to be. So the politics of public housing is one. The other I want to say is we actually try to use videos. We have a video documentary we're working on in terms of alternative media. We do consistent community dialogues, whether it's in specific communities or through the work of the Social Justice Institute. You can find out more about that through case.edu/social justice. The other thing I want to start I want to kind of end with the politics of public housing, women's stories, public housing stories. In some ways, it's just echoed in the comments that were just articulated. And so when I talk about the politics of public housing and how it can help us think about governing logics, injurious perceptions linked to economic imperatives, and questions of humanness and humanity-driven policy, slow it down. I am talking about urban, suburban, urban and suburban space. I'm talking about wherever, because you see public housing is connected to all of these forces, right? It's not the only force. It's an example, an exemplary kind of space to think about these forces, right? So if you're destroying public housing, where are people going?
That's right.
They going places in the city, but they going places out of the city.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And so what's existing for them out of the city? So who has a right to the city? Particularly when the city is being gentrified and it's becoming urban playgrounds, as Mike Davis says, Disney in New Orleans. When Walmarts and other places are taking over in spaces in cities where they're not economically secure living wage jobs and people need public assistance, but we demonize people in public assistance by getting rid of public housing and putting them out somewhere. So all of these things are very connected. And the women, they know this stuff is happening, right? And so it's about their stories are personal stories, political stories, spatial stories, place stories that go beyond race and ethnicity, right? No matter what color you are, what your ethnicity is, what your religious background, what your cultural national heritage are. I mean, these forces are impacting all of us. And so that's how I would speak to Kiaga's question. And I want to say, who is missing, again, who is missing from our tellings and understandings of urban space and what that means in terms of all these other places and spatial formations? And it's linked to corporate power and privatization and gentrification and all of the other things that are implicated in what it means to even define what a city is. Right? And where are the women and how do they provoke us to understand? And so that's where I want to wrap it, where I started. I want to leave it and say thank you all for all your fabulous questions, and to the panel. Thank you.
So We are now going to move into our next final plenary before our session at 6. But in planning for and preparing for this panel, I had the opportunity to communicate with some of these folks. And I just want to thank each and every one of them for their cooperation, for their great insights, and for all of the wonderful work that's being done. So, and thank all of you for your participation in this panel. So, right to the city.